What were you about to do?
Drown the children.
Most people think danger comes from outside, from strangers, from places you are warned to avoid. But in Texas, some of the most devastating crimes happened behind closed doors, carried out by women who were trusted without question. Mothers, wives, caregivers. The people meant to protect life, not end it. Over the years, 10 women crossed a line so final, it reshaped families, courtrooms, and entire communities. Their stories are not loud or fast. They unfold slowly, quietly, and often too late. This series follows those cases in strict order, beginning where no one thought evil could exist. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to stay with this series, and tell me where you're watching from. I always like to know who's out there listening. Spring 1990, Clay County, Texas. Jerry Sternadel had built his life on control. He was a successful Texas rancher and entrepreneur, known for discipline, routine, and an insistence on knowing exactly where his money was and who had access to it. He employed staff, managed land, and trusted a small circle of people to help run his affairs. At the center of that circle was his bookkeeper, Deborah Lynn Baker. Deborah Baker was not simply an employee who stopped by once a week. She was deeply involved in Sternadel's daily operations. She managed accounts, tracked expenses, and handled sensitive financial records. She also shared a close personal relationship with Jerry's wife, Lou Ann Sternadel. The three spent time together regularly. They ate meals together. They discussed finances and future plans. To outsiders, the relationship appeared stable, even friendly. But by the start of 1990, something had changed. Jerry began noticing money discrepancies. Large sums appeared to be missing from his accounts. Withdrawals were showing up that he could not explain. According to later testimony, Jerry confronted Deborah Baker directly. He demanded explanations for missing funds. He told friends and family that he believed he was being stolen from. He also began speaking openly about divorce. He feared that his marriage and his finances were both slipping out of his control. Not long after these confrontations, Jerry became seriously ill. The illness came on suddenly. He experienced severe stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, and confusion. He was hospitalized, released, and then hospitalized again as his condition worsened. Doctors struggled to understand what was happening. Tests did not immediately point to a clear cause. Jerry, however, believed he knew exactly what was happening to him. From his hospital bed, he began telling anyone who would listen that he was being poisoned. He named names. He said his wife and his bookkeeper were responsible. He said the poison was being administered slowly, over time. He repeated the same story again and again, even as his strength faded. Medical staff were told he was hallucinating. His wife told them that medications were affecting his judgment, that stress and paranoia were taking over. But Jerry did not change his account. He died shortly afterward. Because of his repeated accusations, an autopsy was ordered. The results were unmistakable. The medical examiner found lethal levels of arsenic in Jerry Sternadel's body. The concentration indicated repeated exposure, not a single accidental dose. His death certificate listed arsenic poisoning as the cause of death. What had sounded like paranoia was now a homicide. Investigators retraced Jerry's final weeks. They focused on who had access to his food, his medications, and his personal space. Attention quickly turned to Deborah Lynn Baker. During the investigation, authorities searched a storage shed rented in her name. Inside, they found arsenic poison. That discovery led to her arrest. Deborah Lynn Baker was charged with murder. The case went to trial several years later in Clay County, Texas. Prosecutors presented a theory they described as a hate triangle. According to the state, Jerry Sternadel wanted to divorce his wife. Deborah Baker feared exposure for missing money. Lou Ann Sternadel feared losing her wealthy lifestyle. Prosecutors argued that Deborah poisoned Jerry to stop the divorce and prevent criminal charges, allegedly acting alongside Lou Ann. Despite this theory, Lou Ann was never charged. The defense argued that Deborah Baker was being used as a scapegoat. They pointed to inconsistencies and suggested that the evidence did not conclusively prove she alone was responsible. The jury was presented with disturbing facts, but also unanswered questions. When the verdict was announced, it shocked nearly everyone. Deborah Lynn Baker was found guilty of murder. But instead of a prison sentence, the jury imposed probation, 10 years, and a fine. Public reaction was immediate and intense. A man had been slowly poisoned to death. The killer had been convicted, and yet she walked free. For years, Deborah Baker remained out of prison. During that time, she repeatedly violated the terms of her probation. She was charged with forgery. She wrote bad checks. She continued criminal behavior while technically serving a sentence for murder. Eventually, the court revoked her probation. More than a decade after Jerry Sternadel's death, Deborah Lynn Baker was finally sent to prison. Appeals followed. Supporters of the victim continued pushing for a deeper investigation, particularly into the role of Jerry's wife, who had never stood trial. Jerry Sternadel's final days were marked by fear, pain, and frustration. He believed he knew who was killing him. He said it out loud, repeatedly, while restrained in a hospital bed. He begged to be believed. After his death, the autopsy proved that he had been right. This was not a crime of rage. It was quiet, deliberate, and it unfolded over time. Jerry Sternadel died knowing who he believed was responsible. He spoke while he still had the strength. He warned people while there was still time. And even after the poison was confirmed, justice arrived slowly and imperfectly. Westlake Hills, Texas, October 1999. Stephen Beard was asleep when the shot was fired. He was a retired television executive, wealthy, private, and decades older than the woman he had married. His home in Westlake Hills was quiet, protected, and far removed from anything that resembled danger. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no warning. The bullet entered his abdomen while he lay in bed beside his wife. Stephen Beard survived the shooting, at first. He was rushed to the hospital, stabilized, and eventually released. Doctors believed he would recover. To outsiders, the incident appeared inexplicable but contained, a mystery perhaps, but not yet a murder. Inside the investigation, however, nothing about the shooting made sense as a random act. Nothing had been taken. No intruder was identified. And almost immediately, attention turned inward to Celeste Beard. Celeste had met Stephen while working as a waitress at an Austin country club. He was a widower whose previous wife had died of cancer. He was wealthy and emotionally vulnerable. She was younger, struggling financially, and raising twin daughters. The relationship moved quickly. Stephen invited Celeste and her daughters into his home. He promised stability. He promised to legally adopt the girls. They married, despite quiet skepticism from Stephen's family and friends, many of whom believed Celeste was more interested in his money than in him. Behind the public image of a blended family, the marriage was tense. Stephen began questioning Celeste's spending. Financial records later showed that hundreds of thousands of dollars left his accounts in a short period of time. Arguments followed, therapy sessions followed. Stephen discussed tightening financial control. Divorce was raised as a possibility. For Celeste, the security she depended on was suddenly unstable. Around this time, Celeste was admitted to a mental health facility for depression. It was there that she met Tracy Tarleton. The two women formed a bond quickly. They spent time together after discharge. They ate meals together. They talked frequently. Over time, the relationship became emotionally intense. According to later testimony, Celeste told Tracy that the only way they could truly be together was if Stephen Beard were gone. Celeste would deny ever saying this. But what happened next is not disputed. On the night of the shooting, Tracy Tarleton entered the Beard home and fired the gun. She was arrested 6 days later. At that point, Stephen Beard was still alive. Tracy was charged with assault. Celeste Beard presented herself as a loyal wife. She visited Stephen. She spoke to attorneys. She controlled the narrative. The case slowed, waiting on Stephen's recovery. Then, months later, Stephen Beard died. The cause was not the gunshot wound itself, but a blood clot caused by complications from the injury. With his death, the case changed entirely. Assault became homicide, and investigators reopened every detail of Stephen's life and marriage. They heard stories from friends and professionals, stories about money, about arguments, about Celeste speaking negatively about her husband, about her closeness with Tracy Tarleton. Still, nothing moved forward until Tracy herself decided to speak. That moment came after she read a newspaper article. The article reported that Celeste Beard had remarried only months after Stephen's death. For Tracy, it was devastating. She later said she realized then that the relationship she believed in had never been real, that she had destroyed her own life for someone who had already moved on. Shortly before Celeste's trial, Tracy Tarleton gave a full statement. She told police that Celeste had persuaded her to shoot Stephen, that the plan had been discussed, that Celeste portrayed Stephen as emotionally abusive and controlling, that Celeste promised a future. Together, once he was gone. This testimony became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Celeste Beard was arrested and charged with capital murder under Texas law, which allows a conviction even if the defendant did not pull the trigger. At trial, prosecutors argued that Celeste married Stephen for his wealth, spent excessively, and turned to manipulation when that lifestyle was threatened. Financial records were presented, therapy notes were referenced. Witnesses described mounting tension inside the marriage. The defense attacked Tracy Tarleton's credibility. They emphasized her mental health history. They argued obsession. They claimed Tracy acted alone. Stephen's attorney testified that divorce was not imminent. Other witnesses said the marriage did not appear outwardly abusive. Celeste's daughters testified. Their testimony was fractured and emotionally strained. One daughter answered that she did not remember hundreds of times. The courtroom watched a family unravel in public. In the end, the jury believed Tracy Tarleton. Celeste Beard was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole decades later. Tracy Tarleton received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony. Stephen Beard did not die the night he was shot. He died months later from consequences set in motion while he slept beside the woman he trusted most. Like the case before it, this was not a crime of chaos. It was a crime built on access, on persuasion, on trust, and once again, the danger did not come from outside the home. Nocona, Texas, December 2000 to February 2001. Nocona General Hospital was never meant to be a place of fear. It was a small community hospital in rural North Texas, known for quiet hallways and familiar faces. Nurses often cared for the same patients week after week. Families trusted the staff implicitly. Most admissions involved manageable conditions: dehydration, minor infections. Monitoring after a fall, recovery, not death, was the expectation. Vicki Dawn Jackson worked there as a licensed vocational nurse. She had been certified for years and had held positions at several hospitals and nursing homes across North Texas. By late 2000, she was assigned shifts that placed her in direct contact with patients, often overnight. She monitored vital signs, adjusted IV lines, and administered medications. For many patients, she was the last person they saw before falling asleep. Between December 2000 and February 2001, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. Patients who had been stable started dying suddenly. Some had shown signs of improvement earlier in the day. Others had no clear medical reason for rapid decline. At first, staff attributed the deaths to advanced age and fragile health. Elderly patients do die in hospitals. That alone was not alarming, but the deaths continued. Nurses began to talk quietly among themselves. Administrators reviewed patient charts and noticed that many of the deaths occurred during the same shift. Again and again, the same nurse appeared in the records. Vicki Dawn Jackson was present each time. Around the same period, the hospital pharmacist noticed something else. Vials of a drug called mivacurium were missing from inventory. Mivacurium was a muscle paralytic. In proper medical use, it was administered under strict conditions. But if given improperly, it could paralyze the muscles responsible for breathing, leaving a patient conscious but unable to move or call for help. Hospital leadership took action. Medication cabinets were locked. Access was restricted to supervisors, and law enforcement was contacted. What followed was a multi-agency investigation involving local police, the Texas Rangers, and federal authorities. Medical records were examined line by line. Death certificates were reviewed. Bodies were exhumed from cemeteries across North Texas and neighboring states. Families were informed that their loved ones' deaths were under investigation. One patient survived long enough to raise a direct accusation. He reported that a nurse had injected something into his IV without explanation. Another family filed a civil lawsuit after their elderly father died, shortly after receiving an unprescribed drug. In both cases, the nurse named was Vicki Dawn Jackson. She was fired from the hospital. For a time, Jackson disappeared from public view. Eventually, she found work at a local grocery store. That is where she was arrested. Initially, she was charged with 4 counts of capital murder. As investigators continued their work, more victims were identified. The total reached 10. The victims ranged in age from their early 60s to 100 years old. Some had family members visiting just hours before they died. Others were alone in their rooms. None were aware that the person responsible for their care would be the cause of their deaths. Jackson denied responsibility. Her first trial ended in a mistrial after a prosecutor made statements the judge ruled had unfairly influenced the jury. The case was moved to a different venue. A new jury was selected, and the evidence was presented again. This time, testimony came from federal agents who had interrogated Jackson multiple times. According to their statements, Jackson admitted that she had injected patients when she felt angry or overwhelmed. She described some patients as demanding. When asked why she did it, she said she did not know. She did not express remorse. She did not offer justification. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility that her own daughter would be called to testify against her, Jackson entered a plea of no contest to 10 counts of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Nocona General Hospital continued operating. Patients continued to be admitted. Nurses continued their routines. But for many families, trust in medical care had been permanently shattered. The belief that a hospital was automatically safe had been destroyed. In the years that followed, families spoke of unanswered questions and lasting anger. Some wondered how many warning signs had been missed. Others questioned how long the deaths might have continued if inventory records had not been checked. For the community, the hospital never felt the same again. There were no screams, no visible violence, no struggle. The victims died quietly in hospital beds, surrounded by machines designed to keep them alive. Their killer wore scrubs. She checked charts. She blended seamlessly into the rhythm of care. Vicki Dawn Jackson was a nurse. She was also a mother. For a brief period of time, she decided who lived and who died inside a place built entirely on trust. And while these deaths unfolded beneath fluorescent lights and medical monitors, the next case would move somewhere far more intimate, back into the home, back into the family itself. The victims would be children. New Chapel Hill, Texas, May 2003. On a quiet night in East Texas, Deanna Laney walked out of her house carrying a rock. It was late. The neighborhood was silent. Her husband was asleep inside. Her children trusted her completely. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing cases in Texas history. Not because of how it was hidden, but because of how openly it was explained afterward. Deanna Laney was a devoted religious mother. She homeschooled her children. She sang in the church choir. She spoke openly about faith and obedience to God. Friends described her as loving and attentive. There was no history of abuse, no prior violence. To those around her, nothing about her life suggested danger. In the days leading up to the killings, however, her behavior had changed. Laney had begun speaking about the end of the world. She told people that God was giving her messages, that she was being tested, that something terrible was coming, and she needed to prepare her family. These statements were not met with alarm. In her religious community, intense faith was not unusual. Her words were interpreted as spiritual concern, not delusion. On the night of May 9th, Laney woke her oldest son, Joshua. He was 8 years old. She led him outside into the yard. There, she lifted a large rock over her head and brought it down onto his skull. The blow was fatal. Joshua died where he fell. She then went back into the house and woke her second son, Luke. He was 6 years old. She led him to the same spot in the yard and killed him in the same way. Like his brother, Luke died from blunt force trauma to the head. There was no struggle, no attempt to escape. Both boys trusted their mother until the final moment. After killing her 2 older children, Laney returned to the house and went to the crib of her youngest son, Aaron. He was just over a year old. She attempted to kill him as well, striking him with a rock and placing a pillow over his face. Aaron survived, but he suffered severe head injuries that caused lasting brain damage. Afterward, Laney did not flee. She did not hide what she had done. She called emergency services and asked what she should do next. When police arrived, they found the bodies of Joshua and Luke in the yard. Aaron was still alive. Laney made no attempt to deny her actions. She told officers that God had ordered her to kill her children. She said she believed that if she did not obey, something even worse would happen. She believed she was saving them. The investigation moved quickly, but the legal path was complicated. Laney was evaluated by multiple mental health experts. Psychiatrists for both the prosecution and the defense examined her. So did an independent expert appointed by the court. All reached the same conclusion. At the time of the killings, Deanna Laney was suffering from severe psychotic delusions. She did not understand that what she was doing was wrong. She believed God was speaking directly to her. She believed her children would be resurrected. She believed obedience was the only option. Under Texas law, criminal responsibility depends on whether a defendant understands the difference between right and wrong at the time of the act. In Laney's case, every expert testified that she did not. At trial, the jury heard graphic testimony. They also heard detailed explanations of Laney's mental state. The court psychiatrist testified that she showed no remorse immediately after the killings because she believed she had done the right thing. Only after being treated with medication did she begin to understand the reality of her actions. When that realization came, it was overwhelming. The jury found Deanna Laney not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a maximum security psychiatric hospital where she remained for years. Eventually, she was released under strict conditions. She is prohibited from unsupervised contact with minors. She must continue mental health treatment. Her youngest son, Aaron, survived but carries the physical and emotional consequences of that night for the rest of his life. The case divided public opinion. Some saw it as a failure of the system. Others saw it as a tragic example of untreated mental illness. But no one disputed the outcome of the facts. 2 children were dead, a third was permanently injured, and the person responsible had believed with absolute certainty that she was doing God's will. Unlike other cases in this series, there was no financial motive, no attempt to escape consequences, no effort to conceal the crime. Deanna Laney told the truth immediately, because in her mind, there was nothing to hide. The danger did not come from anger or greed. It came from delusion. And while this case ended in a psychiatric facility rather than a prison cell, the devastation was the same. A family was destroyed. A community was left questioning how faith, warning signs, and mental illness had collided so catastrophically. The next case will not involve voices from God or a psychotic break. Instead, it will involve planning, deception, and a woman who claimed she was pregnant even as she prepared to steal someone else's child. And once again, a mother would become the center of irreversible violence. Houston, Texas, May 2001. Linda Carty wanted people to believe she was pregnant. She told neighbors she was expecting a baby. She spoke casually about an upcoming birth. She mentioned due dates, names, and plans. To some, the story felt strange. There were no visible signs of pregnancy, no medical visits, no preparations that made sense. But most people did not question it. They accepted it as another detail in an already unsettled life. Behind the story she was telling was a plan that would end with a young mother dead and a newborn stolen. Linda Carty was born outside the United States and later moved to Texas. Over the years, her life became increasingly unstable. She struggled financially. Her relationships deteriorated. She had prior encounters with law enforcement, including time spent working as a drug informant. By 2001, she was separated from her husband and living under mounting pressure. Friends later described her as erratic and increasingly desperate. In the weeks before the crime, Carty intensified her claims of pregnancy. She told people the baby was coming soon. She told her husband she was carrying his child. She told acquaintances that she had already given birth. These statements contradicted each other, but they all served the same purpose. They created a narrative that would later be used to explain the sudden appearance of a newborn. On the night of May 16th, that narrative turned deadly. Joanna Rodriguez was at home with her husband and their newborn son. She was 20 years old. The baby was only days old. Late that night, intruders forced their way into the apartment. Joanna was taken at gunpoint. Her husband was restrained and left behind. The newborn was taken with them. The invasion was fast and controlled. There were no random acts. Everything pointed to planning. Hours later, police would discover Joanna Rodriguez's body. She had been suffocated. The newborn was alive. Investigators immediately began piecing together what had happened. Witnesses came forward describing a woman who had been telling people she was pregnant. A neighbor recalled seeing a car seat inside Linda Carty's vehicle. Others remembered conversations that suddenly took on a far more sinister meaning. Police contacted Carty and asked her to come in for questioning. She cooperated. During questioning, Carty told investigators where to find the vehicles used in the crime. In one car, police found the baby, unharmed. In another, they found Joanna Rodriguez's body. Carty's fingerprints were present in the vehicles. Baby supplies were recovered. Phone. Records showed repeated calls between Carty and her co-defendants during the critical hours surrounding the abduction. The case against her formed quickly. At trial, prosecutors laid out a narrative of deception and intent. They argued that Linda Carty had staged a pregnancy and orchestrated the kidnapping in order to steal a child she could pass off as her own. Witnesses testified about her repeated claims of impending motherhood. Neighbors described the strange inconsistencies in her story. Phone records, fingerprints, and physical evidence tied her to the crime. The jury heard how Joanna Rodriguez had been taken from her home and suffocated. They heard how the baby had been transported between vehicles. They heard how Carty had presented herself afterward as a new mother. Linda Carty was convicted of capital murder. She was sentenced to death. Her co-defendants received lengthy prison sentences, but were not condemned to execution. That disparity would later become central to appeals and public debate. Carty maintained her innocence. She claimed she had been framed by the men involved. She said they targeted her because of her past as a drug informant. She insisted she had not been present at the murder itself. The courts rejected her arguments. Over the years, her case attracted international attention. Appeals argued ineffective assistance of counsel. Legal teams raised concerns about evidence handling and interrogation practices. Foreign governments questioned whether proper consular notification had occurred. None of these efforts altered the verdict or the sentence. Linda Carty remained on death row. For the family of Joanna Rodriguez, the focus never shifted to legal technicalities. A young woman had been taken from her home. A new mother had been suffocated. A baby had nearly vanished into a lie constructed long before the crime itself. No appeal could undo that loss. No explanation could soften the violence of what had been done. This was not driven by delusion or religious belief. There were no voices from God, no psychotic break recognized by doctors. What happened here required planning. It required sustained deception. It required identifying a vulnerable target and acting without hesitation. Linda Carty did not say she was commanded to kill. She said she was about to give birth. The crime was calculated, the lies were rehearsed, and the violence was final. As the years passed, Carty remained incarcerated, her sentence unchanged. The child she tried to steal grew up knowing the truth of what happened. Joanna Rodriguez's name became inseparable from a case studied for its cruelty and its consequences. This was not a moment of madness, it was a decision. And while the previous case ended in a psychiatric facility, this one ended on death row, marking a stark contrast in how the justice system responds to different forms of maternal violence. The next case will shift again, away from strangers and newborns, away from planning and staged lies. It will return to marriage, to jealousy, and to a moment captured on video, where rage unfolded in public and no explanation would ever be enough to erase what was seen. Nassau Bay, Texas, July 2002. Clara Harris did not plan a crime that would unfold in silence. What she did happened in public, in a hotel parking lot, under bright lights, surrounded by witnesses, and captured on video that would be replayed for years. Clara Harris was a successful dentist and a former beauty pageant contestant. She was intelligent, driven, and socially polished. She lived near Houston in an affluent community and shared both a home and a professional life with her husband, David Harris, a well-known orthodontist. Together, they owned a chain of orthodontic offices and lived comfortably. They were raising 3 children between them, including twin sons and David's teenage daughter from a previous marriage. To outsiders, their life looked stable, privileged, secure. Inside the marriage, it was unraveling. David Harris was having an affair. Clara suspected it long before she could prove it. She noticed changes in his behavior, late nights, unexplained absences, excuses that did not align. She confronted him more than once, but the answers never satisfied her. Eventually, driven by suspicion and desperation, Clara hired a private investigator to follow her husband. That decision set everything in motion. On the evening of July 24th, the investigator contacted Clara with confirmation. David Harris was at a hotel in Nassau Bay with another woman. The message was clear. There was no longer any doubt. Clara drove to the hotel immediately. Inside the lobby, she confronted David and his mistress. Witnesses later described the encounter as emotional and chaotic. Voices were raised. The situation escalated quickly. Hotel employees intervened and escorted Clara out of the building, telling her to leave the property. She walked to her car. Moments later, David Harris exited the hotel with the woman he had been seeing. They stepped into the parking lot, unaware of what was about to happen next. Clara Harris started her Mercedes and drove forward. She struck her husband with the vehicle. David was knocked to the ground. According to witnesses, the car did not stop. Clara drove in a circular pattern through the parking lot. Testimony later stated that David was run over more than once. Her teenage stepdaughter was in the passenger seat, screaming for her to stop. Other witnesses stood frozen, unable to intervene. David Harris died at the scene. The entire incident was recorded by the private investigator's video camera. The footage showed the movement of the vehicle, the circling, the aftermath. It would become the central piece of evidence in the case. Clara Harris was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the defense did not deny that Clara had been driving the car. Instead, they focused on her mental and emotional state. They argued that she had been overcome by sudden passion after discovering her husband's betrayal. They claimed she did not intend to kill him, that she was emotionally overwhelmed, that she did not fully comprehend what she was doing in the chaos of the moment. The prosecution rejected that narrative. They pointed to the video. They emphasized the time it took for the vehicle to circle the parking lot. They argued that Clara had opportunities to stop, that she chose not to, that this was not an accident or a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act carried out with a deadly weapon. Witnesses testified. The stepdaughter took the stand and described begging Clara to stop the car. The medical examiner testified about the injuries sustained. The video was shown repeatedly. In the end, the jury reached a compromise. Clara Harris was found guilty of murder, but under a finding of sudden passion. The distinction mattered under Texas law. It reduced the potential sentence. The jury imposed the maximum allowed under that finding, 20 years in prison and a fine. Clara Harris was sent to a Texas prison, where she worked converting textbooks into Braille for blind students. Over the years, she applied for parole multiple times. Each time, the same evidence followed her. The video, the testimony, the image of a man lying in a parking lot while a car circled. Parole was denied more than once. Eventually, years later, Clara Harris was granted parole and released. She served the remainder of her sentence under supervision before being fully discharged. The case never faded from public memory. Some viewed Clara Harris as a woman pushed beyond her breaking point by betrayal and emotional devastation. Others saw her as someone who turned rage into lethal force in full view of the world. The existence of video evidence left little room for interpretation. It showed movement. It showed repetition. It showed a fatal decision, unfolding in real time. Unlike earlier cases in this series, this was not hidden. There were no staged lies, no poison, no intruders, no quiet manipulation. The violence was immediate and visible, leaving no ambiguity about who was responsible. David Harris did not die in his home. He did not die alone. He died in a hotel parking lot, surrounded by witnesses. And the woman responsible did not deny being there. She denied intent. The court determined that intent could not be separated from action. This case marked another shift in the pattern. Not delusion, not long-term deception, but rage, immediate, explosive, public. And while this killing unfolded under open sky and surveillance cameras, the next case would return to secrecy. Back inside a house, back into the night, back to children who should have been safe in their beds, and once again, they would not be. Houston, Texas, June 2001. Andrea Yates believed she was saving her children. That belief did not appear suddenly. It did not arrive in a single moment of panic or rage. It developed slowly, over years, shaped by severe mental illness, rigid religious thinking, repeated medical warnings, and a pattern of intervention that never held long enough to prevent catastrophe. By the time it reached its final conclusion, 5 children would be dead, and the failure would belong not only to one woman, but to everyone who had seen the danger coming. Andrea Yates lived in Houston with her husband, Rusty Yates, and their children. The family followed a strict, conservative religious lifestyle. Andrea did not work outside the home. She homeschooled the children. Much of her life revolved around motherhood, obedience, and the belief that her role was to raise perfect, morally pure children. The family lived simply and, at times, in near isolation. Long before June 2001, Andrea Yates was unwell. She suffered from severe postpartum psychosis and major depressive disorder, with psychotic features. She had been hospitalized multiple times. She had attempted suicide. She experienced hallucinations and delusions. Doctors warned her family repeatedly that additional pregnancies would worsen her condition. They warned that stress, isolation, and constant childcare posed serious risks. Despite these warnings, Andrea continued to give birth. After each pregnancy, her mental state deteriorated further. She became withdrawn, she stopped eating properly, she struggled to care for herself. She spoke less. She fixated on religious ideas of sin, punishment, and eternal damnation. She began to believe she was a bad mother, incapable of raising her children correctly. Over time, those beliefs hardened into delusions. Andrea came to believe that her children were doomed. She believed Satan was influencing them. She believed they would grow up to be evil. She believed that if they lived, they would suffer eternal punishment. And eventually, she believed that killing them, while they were still innocent, was the only way to save their souls. These thoughts were not hidden. Andrea expressed them to medical professionals. She expressed them to family members. She was hospitalized and then released. Medications were adjusted. Supervision increased briefly, then faded. Each time, the system reset, placing her back into the same environment that had already proven dangerous. In the months leading up to the killings, Andrea's condition worsened significantly. She stopped speaking almost entirely. She barely ate. She became increasingly detached from reality. Her doctors warned that she should not be left alone with the children. For a time, her husband complied, but eventually, routines resumed. Andrea was once again left alone in the house. On the morning of June 20th, Andrea waited until Rusty Yates left for work. Then, one by one, she drowned her 5 children in the bathtub. The oldest was 7 years old, the youngest was 6 months old. Afterward, she placed their bodies on a bed. She called emergency services. Then she called her husband. When police arrived, Andrea did not resist. She did not attempt to flee. She calmly told officers what she had done. She said she was a bad mother. She said she deserved to be punished. The case shocked the nation. At her first trial, prosecutors argued that Andrea Yates knew right from wrong. They pointed to her decision to wait until she was alone. They emphasized the calls she made after the killings. They argued these actions demonstrated awareness and intent. The defense presented a very different picture. They introduced extensive medical records, testimony from psychiatrists, documentation of hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and psychotic episodes. Experts testified that Andrea believed killing her children was an act of salvation, not murder, that she believed she was protecting them from eternal suffering, that she did not understand her actions as wrong. Despite this, Andrea Yates was initially convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. That verdict did not last. It was later overturned due to false expert testimony presented during the trial. At her retrial, the jury heard a clearer account of her mental state. This time, they reached a different conclusion. Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital, where she remains. The outcome did not bring peace. 5 children were still dead. A mother was institutionalized indefinitely. And the question that lingered was not whether Andrea Yates was ill, but how many opportunities had existed to stop what happened. Doctors had warned against further pregnancies. Family members had voiced concern. Hospitalizations had occurred. Each warning was documented. Each intervention was temporary. When supervision ended, the risk returned. Unlike earlier cases, this was not driven by anger, jealousy, or financial gain. There was no deception, no attempt to hide the crime, no effort to escape consequences. The killings were methodical, quiet, and rooted entirely in delusion. Andrea Yates did not believe she was committing murder. She believed she was committing an act of mercy. Her case became one of the most widely discussed examples of maternal filicide in American history. It reshaped conversations about postpartum mental illness, religious extremism, and the limits of criminal responsibility. It forced courts, doctors, and families to confront how easily warning signs can be acknowledged yet still ignored. For the Yates family, there was no resolution that resembled justice. 5 children were gone. A mother would never return to normal life, and a system designed to protect the vulnerable had failed at every critical moment. The next case will be different again. There will be no documented psychosis, no years of hospital records, no medical consensus explaining what went wrong. Instead, there will be blood, a staged scene, and a mother who insists to this day that she had nothing to do with what happened. Rowlett, Texas, June 1996. Darlie Routier says she woke up to an intruder. According to her account, a man dressed in black attacked her in the early hours of the morning, stabbed her, killed her 2 sons, and fled through the garage. What followed became one of the most controversial and emotionally charged murder cases in Texas history, one that has divided juries, experts, and the public for decades. Darlie Routier lived in Rowlett, a quiet suburb northeast of Dallas, with her husband Darren and their 3 children. On the night of June 6, 1996, the family was home together. The 2 older boys, Damon and Devin, had fallen asleep on the living room floor near the television. Damon was 5 years old. Devin was 6. Their infant brother slept upstairs in a crib. Sometime after 2 in the morning, emergency services received a frantic call. Darlie Routier was screaming. She said her children had been stabbed. She said someone had broken into the house. Police and paramedics arrived to a chaotic scene. Damon and Devin were found with multiple stab wounds. Despite emergency efforts, both boys were pronounced dead shortly afterward. Darlie herself had been injured. She had stab wounds to her neck and arm and bruising on her body. She was bleeding heavily and was transported to the hospital, where doctors treated her injuries. From the beginning, she insisted she had been attacked by an unknown intruder. Investigators began examining the house almost immediately. They found no clear signs of forced entry. A screen in the garage appeared cut, suggesting a possible escape route, but glass from the window was found on top of items that should have been disturbed if the break-in occurred as described. Bloodstain patterns in the living room raised questions about movement and timing. A knife later identified as the murder weapon was found in the kitchen sink, bearing Darlie Routier's fingerprints. As the investigation continued, attention slowly shifted. Police began questioning whether an intruder could realistically have entered the home, committed the attack, and escaped without being seen or leaving clearer evidence. The timeline was tight. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. No footprints were found outside. No suspects matching Darlie's. Main description were identified. 9 days after the murders, the case took a dramatic and lasting turn. Footage surfaced of Darlie Routier at her son's graveside birthday memorial. The video showed her smiling, laughing, and spraying string as family members sang. To many who saw it, the footage felt jarring. Prosecutors would later argue it showed a lack of genuine grief. The defense argued the video was taken out of context, noting that a solemn prayer service had occurred earlier and was not shown. The image of that video would follow Darlie Routier throughout the trial. At court, the prosecution presented a case built on physical evidence and behavior. They argued that Darlie Routier had staged the crime scene after killing her sons. They pointed to the nature of her wounds, claiming they were less severe than those of the children. They argued the blood evidence suggested manipulation rather than chaos. They emphasized inconsistencies in her statements and the improbability of an intruder escaping unnoticed. The defense challenged nearly every point. They presented their own forensic experts, who argued that the bloodstain analysis was flawed and that the scene was far more chaotic than prosecutors suggested. They emphasized that Darlie's neck wound came dangerously close to critical blood vessels. They argued that no clear motive had ever been established. Financial stress was suggested by the prosecution, but the defense maintained it did not rise to the level of murder. Despite the lack of a clear motive, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Darlie Routier was convicted of capital murder for the death of one of her sons and sentenced to death. The verdict applied to one child, but the deaths of both boys formed the foundation of the case. Her husband, Darren, was never charged. Their youngest son survived and grew up without his brothers. Over time, the Routier case became a lightning rod for debate. Supporters argued that evidence had been mishandled and that reasonable doubt was ignored. Critics argued that the physical evidence clearly pointed to guilt. Appeals followed. Over the years, defense teams focused on forensic re-examination, DNA testing, and claims of procedural errors. New testing was requested on various items of evidence. Each development reignited public debate. Each delay prolonged the uncertainty. As of today, Darlie Routier remains on death row, maintaining her innocence. 2 young boys were killed in their own home. A mother survived, and the story of what happened in that living room has never stopped being questioned. Unlike earlier cases, this one does not rest on documented psychosis or a confession. There are no voices from God, no acknowledged mental break recognized by doctors at the time. What exists instead is a crime scene, conflicting interpretations, and a verdict that remains one of the most disputed in modern Texas history. For some, the case represents a miscarriage of justice. For others, it represents a crime hidden behind performance and denial. What cannot be disputed is the outcome. Damon and Devin Routier never woke up. And while this case remains unresolved in the minds of many, the next one will look very different. There will only be a confession, a plea, and the quiet aftermath of a crime that left no doubt about who was responsible. Brownsville, Texas, March 2012. Lisa Diaz did not describe an intruder. She did not tell police a story about a stranger in the night or an accident that spiraled out of control. What emerged instead was slower, heavier, and far more difficult to confront. A pattern of violence carried out inside an ordinary home, hidden behind closed doors until a 2-year-old child's body could no longer endure it. Lisa Diaz lived in Brownsville, Texas, with her young daughter Ruby and her boyfriend. To the outside world, the household did not draw attention. There were no repeated police calls, no obvious disturbances. Neighbors later said the family kept to themselves. Nothing about the home signaled what was happening inside. Ruby was 2 years old. She was small, dependent, and entirely reliant on the adults around her for protection. That protection never came. The case came to light when Ruby was brought to the hospital unresponsive. Emergency staff immediately knew something was wrong. The child had visible bruises across her body. Her breathing was shallow. She showed no meaningful response to stimulation. Doctors rushed her into emergency care and began imaging scans. What they saw left no doubt. Ruby had suffered catastrophic head injuries. Her brain was severely swollen. There were signs of blunt force trauma. Her body showed bruises in different stages of healing, indicating repeated injuries over time rather than a single incident. Some injuries were fresh, others were older. Together, they painted a picture of sustained abuse. Ruby was pronounced dead shortly afterward, medical. Staff contacted law enforcement immediately. An autopsy confirmed what doctors already suspected. The injuries were not consistent with a fall or accident. They were the result of repeated physical abuse. The medical examiner described the injuries as severe, prolonged, and intentional. Lisa Diaz was taken into custody for questioning. At first, she attempted to deflect responsibility. She suggested Ruby had fallen. She implied clumsiness. Those explanations collapsed almost immediately under medical scrutiny. The injuries were too extensive, too patterned, too severe for accidental causes. Confronted with the evidence, Lisa Diaz began to admit what had happened. She told investigators that she had beaten her daughter repeatedly. She admitted using her hands and objects. She admitted losing control. She admitted that the abuse had occurred over weeks, possibly longer. There was no single moment she could point to. No isolated incident. It was ongoing. Her boyfriend was also charged, accused of participating in or allowing the abuse. Prosecutors would later argue that even when he was not actively striking the child, he failed to intervene, failed to report, and failed to protect. But the focus of the case remained on Lisa Diaz, Ruby's mother, the person legally and morally responsible for her safety. At trial, prosecutors described the abuse as prolonged torture. They presented testimony from doctors who detailed the extent of Ruby's injuries. The jury heard about internal bleeding, skull fractures, and trauma that no 2-year-old could survive. They heard how Ruby would have been in pain long before the final injuries that ended her life. There was no debate about mental illness. Lisa Diaz did not claim she heard voices. She did not claim divine instruction. She did not claim she did not understand right from wrong. Her defense focused instead on stress and circumstances. They argued she was overwhelmed, that she lacked support, that she lived in poverty, that she was struggling. None of those arguments challenged the medical evidence. None explained the duration or severity of the abuse. The jury deliberated with the facts laid bare. Lisa Diaz was convicted of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought legal finality, but it did not answer the questions that lingered for those who encountered the case. How long had Ruby suffered? How many chances there had been to intervene? How easily abuse can remain hidden when a child is too young to speak and too isolated to be seen. Ruby did not die suddenly. She lived through repeated harm until her body could no longer compensate. She lived in pain inflicted by the person meant to protect her. There were no witnesses, no escape, no safe adult to turn to. For investigators and medical professionals, the case reinforced a grim reality. Some of the most severe child abuse cases do not announce themselves. They do not involve dramatic scenes or public violence. They unfold quietly inside ordinary homes where routine masks cruelty. By the time authorities are alerted, it is often too late. Lisa Diaz now remains incarcerated, her sentence fixed and final. Ruby is remembered through autopsy photographs, medical testimony, and court transcripts. There are no memories of school, no birthdays beyond the age of 2, no future that was ever allowed to form. Unlike other cases in this series, there is no controversy surrounding guilt, no disputed timelines, no competing forensic interpretations, no unanswered questions about responsibility. The facts were clear, the confession was clear, the outcome was unavoidable. And while this case centered on prolonged abuse rather than a single explosive act, the next one will shift again. It will involve a younger mother, a sudden act of violence, and a crime tied not to years of mistreatment, but to loyalty, identity, and a decision made in a single moment. Once again, a child will be left behind, and once again, the damage will be permanent. Garland, Texas, August 2010. Ashley Page Benton did not grow up planning to become a killer. She was young, impulsive, and deeply influenced by the people around her. By the time violence entered her life, it did not arrive as a sudden shock. It arrived as loyalty, as identity, as a belief that proving herself mattered more than the consequences that would follow. Ashley Benton was in her early 20s and already a mother. Her life in the Dallas area was unstable. She moved between relationships, struggled financially, and increasingly attached herself to people connected to gang culture. That world offered something she felt she lacked elsewhere: belonging, protection, purpose. It also demanded obedience. By the summer of 2010, Benton was romantically involved with a known gang member. Through him, she became connected to a group whose conflicts were ongoing and violent. Disputes were settled not with words, but with weapons. Loyalty was measured by action. That loyalty would soon be tested. On an August night in Garland, Texas, Benton was part of a group moving through a residential area. The target was a young man believed to be affiliated with a rival group. He was not armed. He was not expecting what was about to happen. Witnesses later told police that Benton was present from the beginning. She was not a bystander. She was not dragged into the situation. She knew what was planned. When the confrontation occurred, it escalated quickly. Gunfire erupted. The young man was shot and killed. The group fled the scene, scattering into the neighborhood. Benton left with them. Police arrived to find a body in the street and little immediate cooperation from witnesses. The neighborhood was tight-knit and fearful. People knew what talking could mean. For a time, the case stalled. But it did not stop. Detectives began identifying suspects through phone records, surveillance footage, and confidential informants. Benton's name surfaced repeatedly, not as someone who had been present by accident, but as someone who had played an active role. When she was arrested, Benton denied pulling the trigger. That denial did not end the case. Under Texas law, participation in a gang-related murder does not require firing the weapon to carry the same consequences. Prosecutors argued that Benton had knowingly participated in the crime, that she had aided and encouraged the act, that her presence and actions contributed directly to the killing. Evidence supported that claim. Witness testimony placed her at the scene. Messages recovered from phones showed her involvement in the lead-up. Statements from co-defendants described her role in luring and confronting the victim. The picture that emerged was not of a passive participant, but of someone eager to prove loyalty. At trial, prosecutors emphasized choice. They argued that Ashley Benton was not forced into the situation. She was not coerced. She was not threatened. She made decisions at each step. She chose to align herself with violent people. She chose to participate in their conflicts. And she chose not to walk away. The defense attempted to humanize her. They pointed to her age, her instability, her desire to belong. They argued she was influenced by older, more dominant figures. They argued she did not fire the gun and did not intend for anyone to die. The jury was unmoved. Ashley Paige Benton was convicted of murder under the law of parties. She received a lengthy prison sentence, one that ensured she would spend the majority of her adult life incarcerated. The victim's family sat through the trial, hearing details they could never forget. A young man had lost his life over a dispute that meant nothing in the end. There was no lasting victory, no honor, only absence. Benton's child was left without a mother. That fact lingered quietly beneath the courtroom. Proceedings. While prosecutors focused on guilt and defense attorneys focused on mitigation, a child's future was permanently altered. Another life reshaped by a single night of violence. Unlike previous cases in this series, this was not about secrecy or prolonged abuse. There were no closed doors hiding the crime. It happened in public. It was fast, loud, irreversible. There was also no claim of mental illness. Ashley Benton did not say she heard voices. She did not say she was confused about right and wrong. She did not say she acted to protect her child. She acted to protect her place. Her case stands as a reminder that motherhood does not insulate someone from violent identity. That allegiance to a group can outweigh responsibility to family, and that violence committed for belonging leaves nothing behind but loss. The neighborhood where the shooting occurred returned to normal routines. Traffic resumed. Houses were repaired. Life continued. For one family, it never did. Ashley, Paige Benton now remains in prison, her sentence fixed. Her child grows up knowing their mother through letters, monitored visits, and stories filtered through time and regret. This case did not involve years of warning signs or system failures. It involved a moment, a decision to stand with violence rather than step away from it. 10 cases, 10 women, 10 moments where the role people trust most became the source of irreversible harm. These stories did not follow a single pattern. Some were driven by delusion, others by rage, jealousy, loyalty, or control. Some unfolded quietly over time, others exploded in public. But every case shared one truth. The danger did not come from nowhere. It came from inside homes, hospitals, marriages, and families. Places where warning signs were missed, ignored, or misunderstood until it was too late. There is no single explanation that ties these cases together. No simple answer that makes them easier to accept. What remains are the victims, absences they left behind, and the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks familiar, sometimes it looks trusted. This is where the series ends, but the questions do not. If you stayed with us so far, please like our video and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. And let me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's out there listening.